I'm going to do a quick recap of just where I'm up to at the moment. I got this little sprite here, rendering with alpha blending, and then I started to do input, and I said I was going to do input and set shader constants. I didn't quite get to do it all. I'm trying to keep these sessions down to about an hour or a couple of hours, just to keep it concise, and then I've got to do the videos as well, so it's fairly time consuming, but it's keeping me quite organised, and slow and steady progress is the best, I think. Previously, when I've done projects outside of work at home, there's a tendency to just want to rush things, and not having much time means that you take shortcuts and end up doing things that aren't very nice. So I've got here, like, if you can see in the console just down here, it's printing out the mouse coordinate where I'm clicking, and also if I've pressed or held a key down. So I got mouse and keyboard input working within the engine from Win32, and I also added this, the window's a bit bigger. It's like 720p, 1280 by 720 dimensions, and that is done by a little bit of code here. So in the game I can define window width and window height, and in the game engine it uses an extern to pick these up and initialize the game. So if you were using this as a game engine, you don't have to. You can just you can configure things in the engine quite nicely, in my opinion. Some people say that it's not nice style or whatever, but you can just set your parameters here. I've got literally one function, which is the game loop, and I think that's nice for using a game, because I can just literally start one of these games with a main loop and use my engine and use any functionality that I implement. So I just noticed here that my trial version of Visual Studio is going to expire, so I need to sort that out. I think generally Express Edition's fine, but also we do have like global license things from work, which I might get one of those. I don't know if I'm allowed though. So I need to think about that, but I don't think I've really used any features of the professional edition of Visual Studio, and the Express editions are pretty good. I got some updated info in here, so what I'm going to do today is set constant buffer, create constant buffer, and release constant buffer. That's going to be, again, more just sort of typing and writing the code, wrapping it up, implementing the engine side abstraction, and then hopefully what I'll be able to do is just set the constant buffer so that the sprite, I can set the screen position where the sprite gets drawn. That would be a good start. As for constant buffers, I think for most things I'm going to have 2 constant buffers in my shaders, if they exist. So sometimes you might have constants in the vertex shader and the pixel shader. Sometimes you might have them in one shader and not in the other, but my approach will be to have a constant buffer which is per instance specific. So for a sprite or a model, any specific data that draw call needs, and then also have another constant buffer which is data which is shared between different models. For example, you could have a world matrix or a view projection matrix, for example. Sorry, not a world matrix, but for that changes once per render pass. Like, you will set it once for your diffuse pass, or set it for your shadow map passes, and it doesn't change on a per instance basis. So gonna try and do that. I think that's a nice way to do it, and the nicest thing about constant buffers is that you can just patch all of the constants in one go. When you have something like GL, it's got all the GL uniform 1F, and it's a lot of function calls to be making, and just kind of a lot of work. So certainly don't want to be doing GL uniform 1F, GL uniform 2F, and all of those other ones in my API, because I would have to wrap up a direct function to call it. I would have to do the deferred version to make the command buffer so we can call it later. And it's just going to be a lot of work. So it's going to be just simple 3 functions, I think. And then with these, then hopefully I should be able to get the sprite moving around. Once I've got that, I'll be able to start doing some animation or gameplay logic, and hopefully things will start coming together, because I appreciate a lot of the stuff that I've done so far has been quite samey. But I just wanted to document pretty much everything that I've done here. I've recorded almost everything I've done, a few little bits and pieces that I didn't, but I think it'd be cool if I do get some decent progress and start working on a game or a project that looks cool, to look back and be able to see the whole thing build up. And that's sometimes something you don't get if you're just working at home, and you don't sort of remember the amount of work that you've actually put into it. There's always just a mountain of work in front of you, and certainly doing this is keeping me a bit on track. So right now I'm going to get on with writing the renderer functions for creating and setting constant buffers, and I'll also have to add in some parameters in the shader as well. So one thing that I just realised from looking at the D3D samples is that a constant buffer is just a buffer, like a vertex buffer and an index buffer, which I already have the functions to create and release. So what it actually means is I only have to create a set constant buffer method. So that should be actually hopefully pretty quick. What I'm also going to do, I think I'll have to check this for sure, but I think you can bind the constant buffer to specific register. So I'm not going to have any interface which is going to say get constant buffer location by a string. You know how in OpenGL you go GL get uniform location, or D3D get shader variable, or whatever it was. I don't like that. That was always one of the slowest things. I when I'm porting other games, people use get uniform location all over the code. They call it every frame. You don't need to call it every frame, because the shader uniform location doesn't change on a per frame basis. It just changes from shader to shader, and I think the whole mechanism is pretty messy. It makes it easy for the programmer, but it's slow and not that great. So yeah, it looks like you have the T sharp and S sharp registers for textures and samplers, and then the CB sharp for constant buffers. So I'm going to use that to great effect, hopefully. One thing that I'm also doing is all these functions so far, like binding textures or in this case constant buffers, they take the buffer index, the resource slot, and the shader type. They just implicitly set one constant buffer or texture. You can set in one go, you can set multiple textures or multiple constant buffers. At the moment, this is just the single use case. In future, for optimization purposes, it might be necessary to implement the set multiple resources in one call, but I will add another function for those instead of just extending this one, probably. So that's pretty much all the code that I need to write. I added a set constant buffer command with the parameters. I implemented the direct and the deferred rendering API functions. So now I'm going to have to add a constant buffer into my shader. I'm going to set that from the game. Okay, so I declared a C buffer. I called it per instance. I had trouble thinking of what to call these things because it's just a silly example and it's not real data at the moment. So got per instance constant buffer. You can use this register syntax. So it's vertex shader buffer 0. So when I bind it, when I've written the shader, I know what parameters I want to set from the shader. So I'm going to have to set those in game, but I don't need to be finding things by name like how graphics APIs used to make you do things. I don't think that needs to happen, because I am going to be the one writing the shader, and I am going to want, if I'm setting shader parameters from the game, I'm going to have to know what the shader looks like. So I think shaders should be closely linked to the game anyway, and I could even include some code. So say if this shader included a header which defined this, I could also include that in the game, include the header, and immediately use the struct. So I could type def C buffer to struct in C. I could type def this register thing so it didn't exist in C in the header, and then I have one set of constant buffer that the shader uses a header to define its constant buffer. In the game, I define the very same. I include the same header, so I have the same definition of the constant buffer, and the sizes should all be the same. In theory, that should work. There is a few things that I'm going to have to check first. For example, if I put a float in here, or actually, if I put, more importantly, if I do it like this, so if I put a float in here, this float called test, and it isn't used in this shader, the compiler might optimize the constant buffer. The shader compiler might optimize the constant buffer because this value isn't needed. And then if I include this header in my CPP code, then my structs aren't going to be the same size. So firstly, I'll just get the position working, setting the player position, and then I will try and mess around with it and see what behavior I witness. So this single function in the game project is coming pretty large now. Pretty much got all of the D3D things that I've done so far in here. So what I identified here now is that I'm going to have an update sub-resource to change the values in the buffer. So I'm going to have to implement that in the renderer. But for the time being, what I'm going to do is just make sure that this is worked, because I can set the initial data of the buffer. So I'm going to just make sure that this actually works. So it didn't crash, and I think it's worked. So if I'm going to just change these values that I put in the constant buffer to confirm that. So if I set them back to 0, then the sprite should appear in the middle of the screen, which it has done. And yeah, so it's working now. I'm setting the constants. I need to hook it up so that I can update a constant buffer. In terms of my graphics API, I'm going to so in D3D you use the function update subresource, and update subresource can update a vertex buffer or an index buffer or a texture or a MIP level of a texture, and you pass it different parameters. I'm not going to make as a generic one as D3D has, because I have these generic buffer objects, so the generic buffer objects are going to have an update, and later on I will implement a texture update function independently, just because of how I'm handling with the data, how I'm handling the data. For example, this subresource value can change, and it could be the different MIP levels within a texture. But for a constant buffer, you always pass 0, or I guess that you could have arrays of constant buffers or stuff like that. But for this set function, I'm just going to have update buffer with default params almost. And with the update buffer ones, you don't need to supply the row and the pitch and the row pitch and the depth pitch like you would do for a texture. So I'm going to just hook into this mouse press button if statement, and if the mouse is pressed, I'm going to set the constant buffer value and update it to the position of the mouse, that is. So I think the mouse coordinates aren't actually in the client rect space, and might be just the window, the overall window coordinates of the whole desktop. So that's something I need to look at, and then they need to be inverted as well. But kind of cool. I got the constants updating and being set, and that's been pretty much an hour. So I'm going to have a little break now, and I'll probably do a bit more in terms of sorting out the mouse coordinates so it's correct, and I need to do, or I'm meaning to do X input as well in the input library, and a few other bits and pieces. So I'm going to get on with that, but yeah, this is a kind of a cool place to leave it. Constant buffer's working. Woo!